In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Our guest today is the president of one of the most unique narrow gauge lines you'll find anywhere in the world, the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. John Bush.
Nick, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be on your podcast.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. I've heard so much, both from the rail fanning community and the non-rail fanning community, about getting out to Colorado and experiencing Colorado narrow gauge. And I'm sad to say I haven't yet. So for folks who haven't experienced your railroad, how would you describe it in an overall picture?
Well, stated very briefly, the Cumbres and Toltec is the 64-mile chunk, the last 64-mile chunk of what was the Denver and Rio Grande's original main line. The only other chunk, of course, is the Durango and Silverton. It runs 45 miles from Durango to Silverton. We run from Antonito, Colorado to Chama, New Mexico. The railroad was built in 9 months from between Antonito and Chama, in 9 months between March and the end of December of 1880. So to kind of describe the railroad, I guess the easiest way to describe it is that trains got to Chama, New Mexico, which even today is a town of about 1,000 people, only 11 years after the rails joined at Promontory. And while the rest of the world has moved on, the Cumbres and Toltec, or this chunk of the railroad, has not. So when you ride this railroad, you see 64 miles of the way the world looked, essentially, in 1880. It simply hasn't changed. In fact, we like to call it 64 miles of 1880. It's got a couple of tunnels. It's got a couple of big trestles. It goes over over 10,000 foot pass, Cumbres Pass, 10,023 feet. At both ends of the railroad, the elevation is about 7,800 feet. The first 14 miles coming east out of Chama is 4% grade, and the 50 miles from Antonito to the top of Cumbres is about 1.4% grade, roughly.
So that
it's a dramatic example of what we like to call the authentic West. Not the Hollywood West, but the authentic West.
The authentic West is right. And it is amazing how untouched it was even before the preservation era. The fact that this railroad was being run by the Denver and Rio Grande Western with steam up until 1968 is pretty incredible when you figure that standard gauge steam in this country was being phased out in the 50s.
Right. One of the ways we like to describe the railroad here, all the way back to, well, when the railroad was built in 1880, it boomed until about 1894. And then when they repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, mining collapsed, everything collapsed. There was still some mining going on, but it was no longer a license to print money. The railroad, however, was the only way into that rugged country. And so the railroad survived. And it was, like so many of us feel so much of the time in our job, you're too valuable to get a day off, but you're not valuable enough to get a raise. And therefore, it just sort of stayed. It hung on from 1894 until 1968. It got some new locomotives in 1925, The railroad freight fleet was basically rebuilt about 1924 from cars that had been built about 1903. But yeah, to the very end, it was a wooden car, truss rod, arch bar truck railroad, coal powered steam locomotives, and it survived because it was essential but not profitable. It made enough money to stay in business, but not enough to really get any improvements. In the late 40s and 50s, oil was discovered down near Farmington, New Mexico, and the railroad had a boom in the 50s. By 1964, there were finally all-season roads into the territory, and the railroad died. The freight business dried up, and that spelled the end. Then in 1970, the two states of Colorado and New Mexico jointly bought the railroad at 64 miles for the scrap price, and we've been running it ever since. If you look at the legislation that enabled the purchase of the railroad, it's clear that neither of the states thought that the thing would actually survive even 4 or 5 years. And now we have survived for 50 years. So it is a remarkable testament to the dedication that a bunch of people have had to keep this thing alive. And of course, now it's a National Historic Landmark. And we are engaged in the rebuilding and have rebuilt an 1883 locomotive along with our K27, which is a 1903 locomotive, and our K36 fleet, which are 1925 locomotives. So the new stuff on this property dates to 1925.
It's incredible to think that the fact that the railroad is so isolated and, as you say, is the true West, it seems to me that it works in the railroad's favor from a preservation standpoint, because it means that therefore there's less land and property development, so it's more like it was. But then the challenge becomes educating people about it outside of the area, outside of the state, and because you are a tourist railroad, bringing in passengers. So how do you strike the balance between keeping it in that pristine historical shape while also keeping it active and developing in the 21st century and getting the word out about it?
Well, that's the big challenge. That is the big challenge. And where our location is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing in exactly what you said. We have managed, we're still what we were. We're not a recreation. We're not a railroad that has collected stuff from a bunch of other places. But we're not near any major population centers. The closest nearest thing is the capital of New Mexico, Santa Fe, but that's not really a very big city. We're 100 miles from Santa Fe, we're 80 miles from Alamosa, we're 100 miles from Durango, we're 100 miles from Taos, New Mexico. We like to say around here, the Cumbres and Toltec is not at the end of the earth, but on a clear day, you can see it from here. You know, it's remote. Marketing, advertising, word of mouth, customer loyalty have been the primary things that drive this operation. The Durango and Silverton, obviously, Durango is a tourist town, and it's near lots of other destination event things like Mesa Verde, the San Juan Mountains, all that stuff. We are much more isolated than that. That's what has allowed us to stay authentic, but at the same time, it makes developing a passenger base difficult. We have depended on customer loyalty, on word of mouth, on the videos that rail fans, make and post on YouTube and other places. Some films that were shot here have certainly done some good, and we continue to be a place where people want to shoot Westerns.
Let's look at your history, John. How did you get so interested in trains and railroading?
Well, first of all, let me put in a little plug. If people will go to CumbrestToltec.com, on our homepage, there's a little box where you can click a short video called The Railroader, which kind of explains some about the railroad and a little bit of my history. Basically, to make it real short, I grew up in Telluride, Colorado, and I was around in Telluride just before the Rio Grande Southern Railroad died. As a tiny little boy, I went and played in the train yard, and the bug bit me at that point. The railroad was in the process of dying. Trains didn't come to town very often. When they did, me and my little buddies were down in the railroad yard digging roads in the cinders and throwing rocks, the kind of stuff kids do. And they chased us out. And my other little buddies would go off and do something else, like try to fall in the river and drown or fall down a mine shaft. And I basically wouldn't leave. And so eventually they put me up in the cab of the locomotive just to keep from running over me. And I guess that's sort of where the bug bit. And then I had a life-changing episode 2 days before my 29th birthday, where I fell off a ladder and broke my hip and my wrist. And after I got to the hospital, the doctor said, well, you've had a bit of bad luck and you might never walk again. And that's when the little light came on in my head that said, you do not have to be old and have gray hair to die. So if there's something you want to do, maybe you ought to go do it. I was at the time finishing a PhD, so I quit that and went railroading at minimum wage. And so about 45 years later, here I am.
It seems to be, your story reminds me about how Lynn Modinger got into railroading as well. He describes playing in coal piles. So it seems like we need more rail yards and coal piles that kids can play in, and that's going to get more young people in rail preservation.
Well, certainly one of the keys is that we've discovered you don't need to make little kids, boys or girls, like old-time steam engines. You only need to get them around them. If you get them around them, they almost automatically fall in love with them. And if you can get some real exposure early in their life, it leaves a lasting impression. And now, typically, they're fascinated by trains up until about age puberty, at which point they discover the opposite sex and then are very interested in the opposite sex up until they've got a family of their own, and then they kind of gravitate back. One of our big challenges is figuring out how to find that next generation. And of course, that's a challenge for all of us in the tourist railroad industry. How do you find that younger generation? The generation that I am part of at least saw passenger trains and maybe saw steam engines and all of that stuff. So it is somewhat more challenging now that most people don't see them except perhaps commuter trains or long unit coal trains and double stacks. And that's our challenge, is reaching out to a younger generation. And for us in particular, the challenge is how do we reach out to that younger generation without changing the product so much that it is no longer true to what it was. We like to differentiate between what I call the authentic West and the Hollywood West. And a lot of people expect, the train robberies and gunfights and all that sort of stuff, rather than what actually it was like. we try to present what was this really like. Now, we've got a couple of advantages in that when you're out on the Cumbres and Toltec, basically there are no paved roads, no power lines, and no parking lots. And there's also no internet, no cell service. And so you really do get an opportunity to experience the world the way it was 100 years ago, to some extent, 140 years ago.
Today's sponsor for the Roundhouse is Age of Steam Roundhouse, a true treasure of National Railroad. Age of Steam Roundhouse, a true treasure of railroad preservation, is back for its second public season. This is a brand new roundhouse with nearly 24 steam locomotives on display in Sugar Creek, Ohio. The facility features an 18-stall, accurately reconstructed brick roundhouse surrounding a 115-foot turntable, the largest private collection of steam locomotives in the world, and a fully functioning, working back shop where skilled staff actively restore and repair steam locomotives. The railroad is open for tours this summer and fall and is taking all necessary precautions to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Tours of the roundhouse and shop area will be offered Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, July through October. Tickets must be purchased in advance on their website at ageofsteamroundhouse.org. If you haven't seen it yet, visit ageofsteamroundhouse.org and follow them on social media. I wonder if the Hollywood West gets people in the authentic West, though, and your railroad certainly has taken part in a number of notable movies, probably my favorite being Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I wonder if the romance of that era through films like that gets people interested, partially just from a filming location standpoint, like, oh, you guys were in this movie, but also from a standpoint of, yeah, that era is kind of interesting, especially since you have a master's in anthropology. Curious if you see links through that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, obviously, movies, Western movies in particular, give us a sort of a window into the past. And that does encourage some people to come here and to explore the past. It unfortunately gives a kind of jaded or slanted view of the West in which everybody carried a 6-gun and there was lots of gun violence. And while there was gun violence, it is not really what the West was like. The West was largely about people who came up trying to find a better life and a better chance to make a living and maybe make it rich. And we try to show that history. I don't fault the Westerns for getting people interested. We're glad they do. But what we try to do is provide a more complete picture of what it was really like. Rather than the hold-ups and shoot-em-ups and madams and bars.
You worked at the railroad initially from 89 to 96 as chief mechanical officer, then returned back in 2013 as president. How has the railroad changed in terms of its operations from that earlier era to today?
Well, from the time that I was here, starting in 1989, until now, the operational pattern hasn't changed a whole lot. We have made it a little easier to ride all the way across the railroad and come back on a motor coach, not counting what's going on this year. This year is a totally different and very challenging year for us, and I'm sure for everybody else as well. But basic operations still is a train out of each end each day. They go to the center of the railroad, a place called Osier, which was a water tank in the old days, and a section house. And we've got a dining hall there, and we feed everybody lunch, which is included in the ticket. 30 years ago, roughly, when I was here, before you had to buy your lunch separately, so there's a little difference. But other than that, one of the remarkable things about this place is it hasn't changed. We are sort of a eddy in the current of time, and in many ways we try to stay that way. We are challenged in terms of what our customers expect to get now is different than what they expected to get 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But as much as possible, we try to keep it true to that experience, so that you can get a chance to get into what that life felt like, rather than simply having what's going around be a backdrop to a current life. And there's some challenges about all that right now as we get to younger generations and what they expect and what their attention span is, and some of those challenges.
What does being president of the railroad mean to you personally, John?
Well, it's certainly an honor. It is challenging whenever you get into the upper levels of any business, certainly in railroad. You frequently discover that the things that originally attracted you to it, kind of get pushed aside, and you get much more involved in the day-to-day stuff. I liked pulling a throttle and running a lathe, and mostly nowadays I run a cell phone and a computer. But it gives me the opportunity to try to help this place survive. Now, when I was a kid, as I mentioned a little earlier, I saw the Rio Grande Southern go away, and there was a sense of loss there that little kids certainly understand. And I've come to discover the things that happen to you in your earliest years really leave a far bigger impression on your life than a lot of things that happen later. The fact that you either did or did not get your Schwinn bicycle when you were 6, it is a lot more meaningful in your life than whether or not you got your Mercedes when you were 40. It's just kind of the way that gets baked in. So for me, the sense of loss that was attendant to the departure of steam locomotives, the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, the scrapping of all those lines, made me feel, no, I need to do everything I can to keep this thing from disappearing. And so by getting to be president of this, I get to have a role in that is fulfilling to me.
Since you've experienced railroading from all these different levels and positions, how would you compare narrow gauge steam railroading to standard gauge?
It's much more difficult in some ways. There's no support. Nobody's making new narrow gauge stuff. You're not getting narrow gauge stuff off the used market. So we continue to run locomotives that were built almost 95 years ago now. Our new locomotives are 95 years old. If you're running a standard gauge railroad, whether it's a freight railroad or a passenger railroad, there are late model used equipment out there in the market, and there's new equipment. That is not the case here. Here, we can have anything we want as long as we're willing to make it ourselves, is what it boils down to. So that makes it more difficult. we are under somewhat different regulations than standard gauge railroads, and in some ways that makes it easier for us. But by and large, it's more challenging. Now, the locomotives are smaller, so you don't need as much in the way of overhead crane support and all that kind of heavy machinery support to maintain them. You know, the locomotives we have are about as big a locomotive as you can kind of work on by hand. So in some ways that makes it a little easier, you know, than the guys up Cheyenne working on the big boy and the big Northern and you know, all of those other locomotives that are out there, big locomotives. So it's kind of double-edged.
Because there's so much that isn't available that has to be made custom, you have your own restoration shops on site. One of the most recent projects that you've completed, which was certainly quite impressive, was that of steam locomotive 168. Jason Leach asks, how did the idea to acquire and restore that engine come about?
That's an interesting story. When I got back here in 2013, our commission, the bi-state commission that is in control of the property, had already committed to trying to restore some. We had managed to get a couple or three pieces of passenger equipment that dated to the 1880s. Actually, one of them dated to the late 1870s. And we were working on getting grants to start restoring those things. Once I got back here, I said, oh, I know where there's a locomotive we ought to get to add to that fleet. When I was working for the Georgetown Loop Railroad back in the 1980s, the late 70s, early 80s, I got a contract to cosmetically restore a locomotive, a narrow gauge locomotive number 168, built in 1883, that was in Colorado Springs. And I finished that in 1984, cosmetically, made it look like it would have looked in about 1915, and then went off to do other things. And eventually, when I came back in 2013, I discovered that that locomotive was still in the park in Colorado Springs, but nobody had really done much of anything with it in the ensuing 30 plus years since I had finished it. And so, well, 30 years. And so we approached the city of Colorado Springs and asked if we could lease the locomotive with the promise of restoring it again, and this time restoring it to operational condition, which we did. And I've got to give a lot of credit here to Staffy Pappas, who is our special projects manager and my assistant general manager, because he really led the charge on the work of getting it done. And so that's how we came about getting it. Now, of course, we were supposed to put that in service this Memorial Day this year, but COVID has messed all that up. So our 50th anniversary, which is this year, will happen again next year, because 1971 is when we really first started running passenger trains. So we'll have our 50th anniversary next year. And at that point, we'll dedicate that engine. And then additionally, we're going to have a Victorian iron horse roundup. And we will have at least 4 steam locomotives, all built before the turn of the century, out here on this property. One of the nice things about this property is you've got enough railroad that these things can get out and stretch their legs, and you can get that window, that real window, into the past. So anyway, that's how we came to get that locomotive. Our ultimate goal with that is that there will be a 4-car train that that goes with actually a 5-car train, because the Friends of the Cumbres and Toltec, the volunteer operation, has also restored a tourist sleeper made by Pullman, and it is just about completed now. So we will actually have an 1883 locomotive pulling cars that were all built before 1890 on the railroad that they ran on when they were new. And it is essentially unchanged.
That, from everything I've read, is going to be such an incredible event, an incredible celebration. I'm glad that you're able to just take that and move it into 2021. I suppose now is a good time to talk about the challenges that COVID has presented. What have those been for you, and how have you worked to overcome them for this season?
Well, those challenges, as for everybody, have been dramatic. It has been our feeling all year that if we simply said, no, we're just plain not operating this year, it would have a devastating effect on the 2 local communities. And remember, this thing is owned jointly by 2 states. And it's a social enterprise. We're not just a business. We're not just a private museum. We are a social enterprise. So the part of our reason to exist is to help the economies in those 2 communities. You know, several years ago, there was a fire on one of the trestles here. This is before I came back. And so that trestle was out of service for over a year. And we continue, even now, to have people that are surprised that we're still in existence. So we felt that disappearing from the marketplace would be a devastating blow from which would be extremely hard to recover. At the same time, the challenge has been that of getting permission to operate, and the requirements of social distancing. This is a mountain railroad with steep grades. And so as you reduce the number of people that are allowed to ride in any one car, you rapidly get to a point where you can't haul enough people up the hill with a locomotive to cover the cost of running the operation. So that's been a challenge. Additionally, there was a challenge because we're in 2 states. Colorado did allow us to open back up, and we opened up in the middle of June of this year. But New Mexico has only given us permission to open up this month. And we will, in fact, open on the 21st, running trains to Osier from Chama. One of the other problems is a substantial portion of our business has been that you could ride from one end all the way to the other and then come back on a motor coach. Well, because of the social distancing required on the motor coaches and the cost of running them, that's a service we're not offering this year at all. So this year, the only thing we can do is run, most of the summer we've run from Antonito to Osier, fed them lunch and taken them back to Antonito. It's a beautiful piece of the ride, which typically has not seen a lot of ridership because it doesn't have the steep grade. What it does have is a tremendous number of beautiful aspen trees, and it's got the 2 tunnels and it's got the big gorge. We are now going to start operating out of Chama as well. And again, we still have to social distance. So the challenge there is the number of cars we can pull with one locomotive up the steep hill and the social distancing that we have to do in order to do it. So those are some of the challenges. A lot of those challenges are like the challenges everybody else is facing. We are very conscientious about the social distancing. We are very conscientious and demanding about the COVID testing for people, the symptoms testing, the wearing a mask except when you're eating lunch, so that we can keep everybody safe. So that's a challenge. Another challenge has been for us that COVID has largely been more dangerous to older people. And at least on this tourist railroad, our demographic typically is 55 years old plus. And so that demographic is more concerned about travel and being exposed to other people. So that has been a struggle as well.
It's so good to hear that you've been able to open on any level and find a way of operating that will get you through this season. And the fact that you recognize how much these communities that you're connecting rely on you, and that's got to be hard, knowing that there's sort of a civic responsibility is there, or not just the sort of the base layer of you and your employees, but also these communities. It seems that between that and the partnerships that you have with the state, that you're so ingrained in that region, and there's so many important relationships that you have to maintain.
That's true. That's true. Now, additionally, you know, when the railroad was purchased by the states, it was basically 64 miles of rust. And so we have finally been improving it, and we have recognized the need to become self-sustaining, because the money that can come from the states, it is their property, but they have been on again and off again about how much they're willing to invest in their property. So we undertook, about the time I got back here, we undertook a 10-year plan to reach self-sustainability, capital improvements of the track, locomotives, cars, so that we could sustain ourselves. And we're making pretty good progress on all that until COVID hit. And now the other challenge is that the states are pretty stressed, as are all states, by this COVID thing. And so that while we have run this summer, we know we're losing money, and we're trying to make sure we can preserve enough to get through the winter and be open next year. And we hope that next year will be a better year. And we really encourage all of the people listening to this podcast or watching it to come and ride, because we definitely, you know, need the ridership. But we will undoubtedly have at least a couple or 3 years when there'll be almost no state support to complete the capital upgrade program that we had going. And we had not gotten to the end of it. We were on the right path, and we hope to get back on that path as soon as we get some relief from the COVID stuff. But yes, it is challenging to know that there is a responsibility to the community, to the employees, and to the artifact. You know, when these things go away, they mostly never come back. It's a little like extinction. And so survival is key. And for us, survival in what is as close as possible to an original form is key, so that we can continue to be that window into what the West was like when the West was young, you know, which we feel is part of our mission.
Among the allies that you have, one of the ones that has been in existence for a while is the Friends of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. What is their relationship to the core railroad? How do they help you out in preserving this and serving your mission?
Right. Without the Friends, I'm not sure we would even exist. So they're not just an ally, really they're a partner. They work on the buildings, that part of the infrastructure, all of the equipment. You know, we've got over 100 pieces of historic wooden freight equipment. They work on keeping all that stuff up. If it were not for them, we probably would not, we would at best be a struggling little train ride. We would not be able to have kept things up. Rebuilding the piece of the snow shed up at the top, keeping the section houses together. This summer they have rebuilt what was the car inspector's house on the top of Cumbres Pass. They do work along the right of way, weed clearing and tree cutting and that sort of stuff. They are not involved in the day-to-day revenue operation, with the exception of providing docents who ride along and talk about the railroad with all the passengers. But they're absolutely critical to the success and the survival of this railroad. Without them, if we existed at all, we would be a very pale reflection of what we've managed to become. And so it's really a partnership.
I want to take some questions from you guys. First, from Evan Jackson. Over the course of your career at the CNTS, what are some of your favorite memories or moments that you've experienced firsthand?
Well, certainly when we managed to get the 463 back in service, it had last run in, I think it was 53, and it got sold to Gene Autry, and then it came back, and there were several failed attempts to get it running. And when I was CMO, we finally got it running, and we got it into service in '94. That was a memorable moment. We started running the rotary snowplow, which we ran when I was CMO. We ran it 4 times in the 6 years I was CMO. Those were very memorable moments for me personally. The experience I had last fall when we finally took the 168 out on the line and the restored coach number 292, we got up near Lava, and I realized here I was being pulled by an engine built in 1883 on a coach built in 1881, I think it was, looking out the windows of a car that I might have ridden in 1883 or 4, at the scenery I would have seen, and it was a time machine. I mean, genuinely a Technicolor time machine of getting back. I think all of us in tourist railroading have that desire to reach back into the past, to bring it back to life, to experience it, to understand it. And it was seamless. It was the past as far as the eye could see in any direction. There wasn't anything really there to say, hey, this is not, 1883 or 86 or 1920. And those are very powerful memories for me. Pumping air back into the balloon, bringing it back to being viable, so that you can experience it. And for me, I guess in some ways, the railroad is right behind this window I've got covered with a black sheet. The ability to be here and hear a steam engine go by and blow a whistle and not immediately run to the window and look out, because it's become enough a part of daily life that that gets baked in. So that's a very memorable part of all of it.
Peter Rosenquist asks, What are your thoughts on the fire from 2 years ago on the Durango and Silverton oil burning steam locomotives and diesels?
Well, they certainly, I feel very badly for them for the stuff they got put through because of the fire. Uh, it has made us work very hard at our fire mitigation program. We follow every train with two little motor cars with water tanks and pumps so that we can put out anything that might get started. And we stay right on top of that so that we can continue to be the way we were. The Durango and Silverton now has converted one of their locomotives to burn oil. And they're converting another one or two right now. I'm trying to avoid us having to go there. We have a couple of small diesel locomotives, but nothing that could actually pull our passenger trains. And I don't envision us being in a position to be able to buy any of the stuff that may become available out of the White Pass Railroad, for example, or anything else. And so I hope that we don't get to that point. I was asked by somebody, how would you like it to be 50 years from now? And my answer is I'd like it to be kind of just like it is right now. Maybe a little better, a little more popular, but essentially unchanged. So I would like to avoid, and we put an awful lot of energy into avoiding what happened to the Durango and Silverton. Their conditions are different, and certainly it was not all under their control, but we work very hard at what is under our control to make sure that we don't suffer the same consequence.
Kevin Noor asks, what are the long-term capital plans? Roundhouse for Chama?
Probably not a roundhouse for Chama. The locomotives that we have, with the exception of the 168 and the 315, which is over here for a while, that belongs to the DRHS, our roundhouse was never really big enough, even when it was a 9-stall roundhouse, to put any big locomotives in. When they built the shops here in the 70s, they're done in such a way that you can't continue to have that and rebuild the roundhouse where it was. Roundhouses involve turntables, and turntables are an inherent danger. First of all, they're bridges, and so they need annual bridge inspection. Second of all, a roundhouse has tracks that go to a hole. And we've all seen the pictures of locomotives that ended up in turntable pits. In fact, the only one of the K36s that no longer exists because it fell in a turntable pit. So I'm not eager for that. I don't envision that happening for us. I do envision us building some covered storage down where it's out of the sight line so that we can keep a substantial amount of this wooden equipment under cover in the winter so that we can make life easier on our volunteer organization who, trying to maintain 100 freight cars is a pretty tall order, particularly for people who aren't getting paid to do it.
I was impressed when I first started seeing photos of just how long a freight train you could make up. There was a great one in the recent special issue that Trains Magazine ran on your railroad of a train largely comprised of stock cars with an engine on the front and a mid-train helper. And there were something like 30 cars in that consist. The fact that you can bring back that era of railroading, not just through your tourist operation as far as day-to-day ridership, but also these special charters, even maintenance of way equipment that dates back 100 years. It's really incredible that you can recreate those elements of your past as well.
Yeah, and again, there we're tremendously grateful to the Friends for helping keep that equipment where it can be used, and the opportunity again to create or recreate those moments in history when you could hear a wooden truss rod freight train on jointed rail pulled by steam locomotives running by you. We recognize that we are very privileged or blessed in that way, in ways that a lot of the other tourist operations just don't have the opportunity to do. I mean, we managed to grab this 64-mile chunk and a lot of the stuff that existed right when they were going to scrap it all, and that the 50 years that we've had it has allowed us to start doing those kinds of things. Again, an opportunity to really soak yourself in what was that all like. You know, one of the things we're going to do this coming summer, once we've got this tourist sleeper back in service, is we will run a night train from Chama to Antonito with people on the cars, in the cars, so that you can get a sense of what that was like. And of course, being out here in the West at high altitude where the air is thin and relatively clean, under a full moon, this property is just totally dramatic. So we're very pleased to be able to give those kinds of experiences to people.
That will certainly be unique. You're describing that. I see it in my mind's eye, and I totally want to get a ticket for that. The last question that I have for you, John, is at the end of the day, when you look at everything that you've accomplished with your team over the past 7 years, what it's like to experience the day-to-day operations, at the end of the day, what are you most grateful for about your role with the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic?
Well, probably the people that I work with, you know, the team that we have put together. One of the challenges, I suppose, in being president is that you get a lot of attention, where you kind of get to soak up the glory, you know, of what's been accomplished. But it's not what I've accomplished. It's what we as a team, and I'm talking about a team that goes back 50 years, have managed to accomplish and pull together and find, and we continue to look for and try to find young people who are dedicated to trying to keep this stuff alive. So I'm grateful for those people that we have attracted, for the people that have dedicated their lives to being part of it, who share in the vision. Without the people, it all goes away. The machines, the 168 being an example, throw it in a park for 50 or 80 years, you can bring it out and fix it. If you've got people who know how to do it, if you've got the infrastructure that allows you to, you've got the machines, you've got the expertise, you've got people with the passion to put the energy into doing it, and people with the passion to contribute money to make those things happen. Otherwise, it all goes away.
From what
I answered your question.
Oh yeah, you did. From what I've seen, you have an extraordinary team, and you talk about handing it down to younger generation. It's my understanding that you have family legacies here where somebody worked for the railroad or still does, and then their son or daughter then comes on.
I know exactly what you're getting at. We've got a couple of families. In one case, we've got a young guy. He's in fact dispatching today. His father is being a conductor on the train we're running out of Antonito today. His mother is in HR here. She's our HR manager and ticketing manager. Her father and all of her father's brothers worked on the railroad. One of them was in fact born on the railroad in a section house at Sublet, New Mexico. So that family worked on the railroad. He was born there because his mother happened to be there at the time. The reason that she was there was that her husband was a section foreman on the railroad. The reason that he was a section foreman on the railroad was because his father had been a section foreman on the railroad. And so we have found in old census data that he was working for the railroad in 1890. And there is an unbroken stream down that one family chain since 1890 to 2020. That family has been involved with this 64 miles of railroad. So yeah, that is part of the authentic West.
As you said, you can replace parts on a locomotive, you can replace car, you can put paint on a building, but you cannot replace good people, and you cannot replace having a legacy like that. That is just incredible.
That's right. That's right. And that is part of what makes this place so special. You know, and what makes it for me so important that it survive. You know, you think back to Promontory, Union Pacific is still around, but it's not at all what it was in 1869. This railroad is still largely what it was in 1880. So
it's a great reminder of what railroading was and what led it to become what railroading is today in a way that is very original. And it's great that it survives. It's great that you are there to helm a team of amazing people, by the sounds of it, to be able to carry on that legacy and share it with the outside world.
Yeah, one of the things that we find fascinating, you probably see this on the other tourist railroads as well, is the number of people we meet who say, my father, my grandfather, my great uncle, you know, worked for the railroad. And it makes you realize how critical, how big an industry railroading was, and how critical it was to the development of the country. Now, an interesting thing in that is that east of the Mississippi, basically the towns existed and they connected them with railroads. West of the Mississippi, the railroads got built and then created the towns. That's an interesting realization as to how important a part the railroads played in the development of the US, and particularly in the development of the West. The towns formed because that's where the railroad was.
And in a way, these towns that you serve, they're still railroad towns because they are a key, I don't want to say key drop, but in the sense of you're a key part to what led to their formation, and also the fact that those towns still exist to this day because you bring in these people to experience
Absolutely.
the true West.
Absolutely. Chama, New Mexico came into existence because the railroad got here. And it was a helper station at the foot of the steep 4% grade to the top of Cumbres. That's why it got built. That's why people lived here. You know, this town does not have lots of big fancy Victorian houses. It was a railroad town, and it's still a railroad town. So anyway,
It's great to see what a railroad town is still like. It's great to see what a tremendous feat of preservation this is, and how much of it survives and how much of it is coming back to life because of the work that's going on. I cannot wait for this Victorian celebration in 2021, and I encourage you guys listening to check out their website, and I'll have links in the show notes. And you should also watch the Railroader video that John mentioned. I'll have a link for that as well, because it is fantastic 10-minute short film that is incredibly beautiful. John, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse today.
well, thank you for having me, and I really do encourage you to come and ride. You know, this is a bucket list trip for railroaders and for rail fans, and I encourage you all to come and partake in it. We can talk about it, but you've really got to experience it to get it.
Oh,
You know, to get and you get it for an all day long thing. It's not just a quick little snippet. You get it long enough to slow down, long enough to start letting it soak in.